Hi, I'm Isobel from Photo Media at Sydney College of the Arts. Now that we've learnt the basics of exposure for our digital camera, we're going to look more in depth at things like aperture and shutter speed. When talking about aperture, we refer to what we call f-stops or f-numbers. These indicate how open or closed our aperture is. A really wide open aperture has a very small number, like f1.2. A closed down aperture has a large number, like f32. This can be confusing at first, but it'll become second nature over time. Your digital camera will give you a wide range of apertures to choose from. Film cameras have a set scale of apertures you can choose from, something like this. Although your digital camera will give you lots of additional stops in between these full stops, it's really helpful to remember this aperture scale as they represent full or whole stops. This means that each change in stop, i.e. from f8 to f5.6, is an opening up to let twice as much light in. Similarly, if you were to stop down from f16 to f32, you would be letting in half as much light. This is helpful when you're juggling your aperture with shutter speed because you know that a change of a full stop in one department, i.e. aperture, can be balanced by an equivalent change in the other department, i.e. shutter speed. Keep this in mind when you're troubleshooting exposure when experimenting with depth of field, which we'll look at in more detail now. So in addition to controlling the quantity of light that reaches your camera sensor, aperture controls our depth of field. This is the area of sharpness in our image. The smaller the aperture, high f-stop number, something like f32, results in a larger or longer depth of field. A wider aperture, something like f1.2, results in a shallower depth of field. There's no right or wrong depth of field for any particular scene. You'll choose your depth of field based on the amount of sharpness you're after and how you're wanting to lead the viewer's eye around your image. Experiment with different apertures and notice the way that they render your scene differently. These experiments will form part of your homework. Keep in mind that any change in one department, i.e. aperture, requires that equivalent change in shutter speed, so you're compensating to balance out either way. Now we're going to look at shutter speed in more depth. So, as I mentioned earlier, shutter speeds are normally very quick, fractions of seconds. The numbers represented on your camera's screen refer to these fractions of seconds. 250 doesn't indicate 250 seconds, but instead 1 over 250, or a 250th of a second. If you're working at 1,000, that would be a very fast shutter speed, indicating 1,000th of a second. If you are working with a film camera, your shutter speeds will have a set scale, just like your aperture stops do on a film camera. Just like aperture though, with a digital camera, you'll have additional stops in between this full scale stop. As before, it's a good idea to keep this analog scale in mind because it represents a doubling or halving of the length of time your shutter curtains are open. Just like aperture has a direct relationship with depth of field, shutter speed has its own contingent, and that's motion. Because shutter speed is linked to time, slower shutter speeds indicating a longer length of time that those shutter curtains are open, it has a direct relationship with the capturing of movement. Quicker shutter speeds, something like 1 over 1,000th of a second, will freeze movement. Slower shutter speeds, like 4 seconds, will result in movement blur. Which shutter speed to choose is dependent on whether there is movement in a scene. If there is, you want to freeze it in motion or capture it with movement blur. Whilst there's no prescription for which shutter speeds to use when, please keep in mind that if you're shooting with shutter speeds slower than a 60th of a second, you can't handhold your camera. You'll need to secure it on a stable surface, or better yet, a tripod.